Hi everyone, I'll see if I can work this properly. Okay, so heritage crime, training and skills. So where do we go from here? So with heritage crime continuing to be a significant threat, there's a growing need for specific cross-sector skills for archaeologists, police officers and other enforcement agencies. And alongside this, there's also a need for a growing need for formal recognition of skills and competencies for two principal reasons. So firstly, heritage crime officers and police heritage support volunteers, as well as heritage crime advisors within heritage agencies, will be able to mutually support each other. And that's going to help those relationships develop on a consistent basis, and it'll enable a more effective response. And secondly, as John talked about in his talk before, both heritage professionals and police officers can be required to give expert witness testimony in court to assist in prosecutions, and formal recognition of skills and experience will enable them to demonstrate their qualifications in this area in an increasingly hostile court environment. But where do we begin with deciding what those skills should be? So in 2022, Historic England commissioned MSDS Heritage to carry out a project to determine what skills would be required to assist in dealing with heritage crime and to audit the current training provision. So I'll go through the project today. So we had three main aims. So review the current training provision in heritage crime. So that involved identifying what training, both CPD and sort of further higher education courses, is available for heritage crime. And as part of the review, the identified courses were mapped to the appropriate national occupational standards where this is possible. Develop a skills pathway. So based on this review, the project aimed to develop a skills pathway based on the Historic England training model of prepare, enter and sustain. And that included identifying gaps in training provision with recommendations on how those gaps could potentially be filled. And the third aim was to create a special interest group for heritage crime, which, as you all know, was successfully achieved. The project methodology consisted of 4 key stages. So the first stage involved creating a skills and competency matrix to identify key subject areas and topics relevant to heritage crime, and that could be used as a framework to carry out the training review. And in addition to that, the matrix identified potential audiences that might undertake some form of training in heritage crime. And as the management of heritage assets and law enforcement differs between the marine and terrestrial environments, that matrix was split into 2 to reflect that. While the subject areas and the topics are common to both, the difference lies in the content of those topics, in addition to the potential audiences. The review of training provision was carried out as a second stage, and that, as I said, captured both short CPD courses and longer ones. And that research was carried out online using information that was readily available, so we had to make a number of assumptions when it came to interpreting the results. Then the third stage involved mapping those courses against the national occupational standards. If you haven't come across them before, they're developed by standard-setting organisations who consult with employers and other stakeholders across the whole of the UK. And they're grouped into suites, and they can be used to develop skills and knowledge, as well as providing a framework for training programmes. And then we created a skills pathway using the results of the review. And like I said, that's based on the prepare, enter and sustain model. And that contained recommendations for how the gaps in current training provision could be rectified. So we identified 6 subject areas in the matrix. So introduction to heritage and cultural property crime, legislation and strategic content, preventing heritage crime through risk assessment and intelligence, securing and preserving evidence, enforcement and prosecution, and community engagement and volunteering. And then within those subject areas, they were further broken down with between like 3 and 6 topics per subject area. And some of them contain topics which overlap with offences outside of heritage crime. So that particularly applies to gathering and preserving evidence, as methods of forensic investigation will be common to both heritage crime and other offences. So those are the topics. And then our potential audiences were broken down into categories. So we've got heritage professionals, we've got national organisations and government, we've got other professionals like our law enforcement colleagues, members of the public, and voluntary and community groups. So, it's quite a colourful slide for you. So once we identified those audiences, we tried to figure out, well, what level of knowledge would they need for each subject area and topic? And we ascribed 3 levels of knowledge. So not required, an overview required, or an in-depth knowledge required. So we tried to create a visual matrix to kind of make it a little bit more easily visible. And it resulted in a total of 5 matrices for terrestrial and 5 for marine. The slide shows an example of a matrix for heritage professionals within terrestrial. And in order to represent the level of knowledge in a visual way, we used these circles, as it became known in our office, the moon charts. So the fully coloured circles, that indicates that you need in-depth knowledge in that particular topic or subject area. The half circle, so the half moon, indicates that an overview is required. And then if the circle is uncoloured, it means that that particular audience doesn't need sort of any knowledge in that particular topic. And then we've got an example of a marine matrix for voluntary and community groups. So once we completed the matrix, we were then able to carry out the audit of current training provision. So I should say that this audit was a snapshot of what was available in terms of training in 2022, so rather than a completely comprehensive overview. The audit included both talk courses, so we defined talk courses as anything longer than a day, and then also CPD courses and events. And then the subject areas defined in the matrix, we kind of put them into 4 broad categories to kind of facilitate our research. And those categories are policing, heritage crime, forensics, and expert witness testimony. And then we carried out the research and found that actually there was 58 courses in total, 19 of which were CPD, 39 of which were sort of longer further education or higher education courses. Of the CPD courses, the duration ranged between an hour to a day. Most were one-offs or on demand. They tended to be online. 3 of them were conferences. 9 of them were free, and then the average cost of the other ones were £150. And then in terms of our kind of more formal talk courses, then we've got a mixture of BScs, BAs, MScs, and those are modules within a sort of wider course. And you can see that I've put an average sort of cost of those up there as well. So there's quite a few courses that we identified. The majority are accredited in some way, so they're part of a degree or another organisation such as ProQual in the case of the Police Crime Prevention Academy. We didn't quite figure out how many of the CPD courses were fully accredited due to the lack of information, but some of the ones we identified were CIFA CPD approved courses. So once we've got our review, we then mapped against those national occupational standards. Now, there's quite a few. We identified 31 standards that we could use, but you'll be pleased to hear I'm not going to go through all 31. But they kind of cover go across several different suites. So archaeological practice, cultural heritage, emergency response, forensic science, investigations, policing and law enforcement, security management and security risk advisors. It should be law enforcement, not law enforcement. Sorry for that.
Officers of the law.
Officers of the law, yeah. So only 6 of those relate to the historic environment. So as you can see, the majority relate to law enforcement or expert witness testimony. And of the 31 standards we identified across those suites, 24 were successfully mapped against the audit results. So
5 minutes.
5 minutes, right, okay, I'm going to go through. So basically, we identified gaps in training. So the ones highlighted in yellow showed where we weren't able to map any courses across to our subject areas within the matrix. And one of those was the confident contact that Andy mentioned before. And then this one, in terms of being able to map our CPD courses, again, the ones in yellows are gaps, so there was no CPD course in those particular topics. And the ones in green, we were only able to find one course that perhaps mapped to those. So there's clearly some gaps in provision. So based on the results, we were able to put together a skills pathway, which you can see here. So some of this is utilising existing courses, such as those offered by Mark, for example, with the HE Heritage Crime training modules, the CPD courses that are currently offered, and then some suggestions about how gaps should be filled, so perhaps a formal qualification in heritage crime practice, introducing it into youth training programs like scouts, guides, etc. And then the final aim of the project was to create the SIG, which, as you're all sitting here, we successfully achieved. And you can see the aims here, which I won't go through. And in terms of next steps, we made a number of recommendations in our project for how gaps could be filled. So Historic England are currently taking some of those forward, including talking to the academic sector about a more formal qualification. But also the SIG itself is taking forward things like, as Paul mentioned, we've got an edition of the Archaeologists to raise awareness about heritage crime, but we're also going to be working with CIFA to develop a skills and competency matrix based on what we produced in the project, as well as discussing providing a register and panel of experts. And all that leads to basically an accredited skills pathway for non-archaeologists, so our law enforcement colleagues, for example, who gain some form of formal recognition through membership of CIFA at different levels. So that's been kind of like a whistle-stop tour through our project. If you want some information, then obviously ask questions in the discussion, but otherwise, thank you very much.